Numbers there, I mean, it just goes from bad to worse, doesn't it?
It's diabolical, and it is most distressing for constituents in my electorate, where I have a very high population of constituents who herald from the subcontinent, and it is extremely distressing to be seeing at this time.
What are they saying to you? What's the feedback that you're getting?
It's actually very measured. It's well understood that the first priority of government is to keep Australians safe, and that one of the reasons we've done so well in Australia is because our states and our overall international borders are capable of being managed. But at the same time, there is grave concern about perceived inconsistencies here, that we have this rule that has come into effect effectively criminalising Australian citizens from returning home. So there is unrest over that. There is consideration of what sort of precedent this would set. And for many constituents, they have families and loved ones overseas, not for sightseeing. They were given permission to go overseas, and now to be told that they can't come back, lest the threat of jail or a substantial fine, is very distressing.
Just to clarify on a couple of points there, so what's Labor's position on those flights coming back from India, that they should be stopped?
Well, we understand that those flights have already been stopped. So what we need answers on is why is it necessary over and above to be imposing these new requirements. Now, I understand just from the media statements from the government that this is based on medical advice, and we always respect the medical advice. But as I said, the issue here for many in my community, and what Labor questions as well, is the consistency. We didn't have a similar situation in terms of the US or the UK. Even at the height of corona in Italy, we didn't have that situation. But this really is something that is on the minds of a number of my constituents who are extremely concerned.
But you support that move to stop those flights, to pause them for a couple of weeks?
That is well understood.
Yeah.
The question then comes into these other measures that have been brought in and the perceived lack of transparency around that.
Okay. So, I mean, some people have alleged racism here. Do you believe it's racism?
I'm not saying it's racist, but again, I'm not someone who's personally affected by it. And I also appreciate that the predominant view that's been coming out of my community is questions of inconsistency. The first priority of government should be to keep its citizens safe. That includes Australian citizens who are overseas. There's some 40,000 Australian citizens still overseas. About a quarter of those are in India. We need to be doing everything we can as a country to keep our citizens safe. I've even seen reports that the government of Iraq is sending in repatriation flights to get their citizens out of India. Now, if that's the case for Iraq, we've had situations in the past where the Australian government has been very forthright in helping to repatriate. I don't see that happening in this case. And these are the questions that many of my constituents are asking me.
The Chief Medical Officer said on radio this morning that it wasn't his advice to make those flights illegal. What's your reaction to that?
Well, again, I'm not privy to this advice. But again, this points to one of the deep concerns about this lack of transparency. It was seemingly made in the middle of the night. I have a number of community members who aren't necessarily on my side of politics who are quite outraged that this seems to have been done without any consultation. And to be quite frank, some of the manner in which it's been received would say that this has been quite amateur in the way this has been conveyed. Bear in mind, this has never been done in Australia's history, as far as I'm aware, telling a specific class of citizens that they cannot return home. For something of such import, you would expect there to be a lot of thought that has gone into it, and fair enough, if it's based on the medical advice, then we accept that. But the way in which this is being communicated reflects the way in which it is being received by many in our community, unfortunately.
There's also some comments from Alan Tudge this morning who said that the advice from medical experts is that they only want a maximum cap of 2% of people with COVID in quarantine. That's a figure that hasn't really been publicised before. What do you make of that?
Well, this is the first that I'm hearing about it, and I'd be interested to know what the current levels are in any of the facilities that we have, including in hotel quarantine right now. And if that's the aim, then I question, well, how is that going to be impacted by the current bans that are in place? So it is difficult to fathom why a specific target has been set in that regard. But again, if this is based on medical advice, then you would want this to be properly communicated to people so they understand what it is.
Well, 2 out of 100 it seems pretty low.
It seems pretty low, and I haven't got the latest figures in front of me, but I don't know how many cases there are in Australia at the moment, and whether that is actually a figure that's capable of being exceeded or not.
Well, Howard Springs is at 15% at the moment.
Right.
The majority of them obviously coming from India at the moment. So this ban on flights, or this pause on flights, is allowing these quarantine facilities to have a breather, is the comment. I mean, does that make sense to you that some of these quarantine facilities need a breather with these numbers getting out of control in India?
Well, I don't know what the definition of a breather is, but you would assume that the purpose of quarantine is to ensure that the infection is contained. So it would seem to me that the actual number within those facilities really has no bearing on how it's going to infect the rest of the community. But again, if this is the government's medical advice it is receiving, then it should be communicating this much clearer to the Australian people.
If these numbers continue the way they are in India, with some expectations tracking that positive cases may head towards 500,000 within the next couple of days, the advice isn't going to change, isn't it? The travel ban is unlikely to move mid-May.
One would think, and I note that in about 2 weeks that is going to be reviewed. But again, as you say, this all depends on the situation there. It doesn't seem at this moment, unfortunately, to be looking at to an upside. But again, this is something the government says that it will review and will take the medical advice as it stands at that time when it's given.
Would you be comfortable if the flights resumed while those numbers were as high as they are in India?
Again, I think we need to take the advice, but those numbers, they are staggering, and it is an enormous country. And I also understand that some of those outbreaks differ depending on where you are in the country. It's a massive, non-homogenous place. But we should always take the medical advice and monitor the situation as it emerges.